So I'm going to read someone's report on that. I'll read some of my comments first. And I hope when people are listening to this show, always come to the Dr. Susan Tata show with a pen and a pencil, or turn on your recording on your telephone so that you can put the information down. So 138 years ago, something happened. It was called the Berlin Conference. Sometimes when you do your research, it's sometimes called the Berlin West Conference or the Congo Conference. The Berlin Conference of 1884, from the 15th November 1884 to the 26th February 1885. In 1870, organizations like the International African Society and the International Congo Society were formed by Europeans to research and to quote unquote civilize the continent of Africa. Of course, it didn't take long for researching and so-called civilization, quote unquote, to turn into claiming and conquering our countries by France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal, who were scrambling to grab up new lands for themselves after that period we call the transatlantic slave trade. This scramble of sorts was the impetus for the mid-1880s Berlin Conference, where over a dozen European countries met to discuss the colonization of Africa. Now, most people said America wasn't involved, that America didn't have any colonies. That's not true at all. America was at that conference. America was at the Berlin Conference. They helped plan all of this. And American banks, Wall Street, and corporation invested in most of these countries' enterprises. Africa, prior to the Berlin Conference, the large majority of the continent was under local control. In other words, the indigenous African inhabitants were ruling their own people and their own land. Also at the time of the Berlin Conference, in 1883-84, European colonization had focused mainly on the coast of the African continent. Africa's interior remained virtually untouched by outsiders in 1885. Ignoring ancient cultural lines and people group, the participant at the Berlin Conference spent about 3 months devising guidelines for colonizing not just the African coast where they had been for a few hundred years, but the interior of Mother Africa. The discussion at this conference, some of it was to make trade easier for everyone. The conference decided that the Congo and the Niger River would remain neutral and open to all European trade. They devised rules to amicably divide resources among Western countries. They set up international guidelines for making claims to African land. So you have people, a group of thieves, sitting down, plotting and planning as nation states how to invade and conquer and murder and rob another people. There were 13 European nations and the United States who participated in this conference. And I just want to read the names off for the record. Austria, Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, the Ottoman Islamic Empire, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So let's be clear. So we don't think, oh, some of the colonists was good people and some was bad people. and these ones didn't do so bad. No, they all sat and plot our robbery, our murder, and plot the destruction of our institutions, and plot the destruction of our cultural system. And it's something I want to read. I posted it yesterday, but I want to read it again today because this is important to understand. If you're going to understand what we must change if we're to defeat the enemy at hand. And one of the things that we must change, that we have to change, is the culture that governs our daily life. And I know you were discussing that in the last meeting, but we need to discuss it again. And it was decided in Britain, and this was in the early 1880s. One of the Britain parliamentarians speaking before the parliament said he had been to Africa in the Nigeria area, and he had never seen a people so honest, so giving. He had never seen a people so united and strong. And he said, we will never defeat these people unless we are able to destroy their cultural and their spiritual system and replace it with ours. So that's why throughout the colonial era, you'll see the missionaries moving with the soldiers, because it was clear the only way you can defeat Africa is to destroy her culture. The only way you can defeat Africa is to destroy her spiritual system. And then our military victory would make sense. But I'm going to read to you this document because what I want you to see, we never stopped fighting. We never stopped resisting from the first day of the invasions to today. In the history books that the colonialists gave us, in the schools that the churches and the government set up in our nation and our continent, they never told us about our resistance and our great heroines and our great heroes. So I want to read a little bit of that history. It'll be a little boring, but don't let it be too boring because it's important to put it on record, and Susan will have it on record. So why did they choose Africa? You know, and what was Africa's resistance to colonial rule? While African resistance to European colonialism is often thought of in terms of white and black, European and African powers struggling, this presumption underestimates the complex and strategic thinking that Africans commonly employed to address the challenges of European colonialism and its rule. It also neglects the colonial era power dynamic of which African societies and institutions were essential components. After the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85, at which the most powerful European countries agreed upon rules for laying claim to particular African territories, the British, the French, the German, the Italians, the Spanish, the Belgians, the Portuguese, set about formally implementing strategies for the long-term occupation and control of Africa. The conquest had begun decades earlier, and in the case of Angola and South Africa, centuries earlier. But at the Berlin Conference, it became more systematic and overt. The success of the European conquest and the nature of African resistance must be seen in light of Western Europe's long history of colonial rule, economic exploitation around the world. In fact, by 1885, Western Europe had mastered the art of dividing and conquer and rule, honing their skills over 400 years of imperialism and exploitation in the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific. In addition, the centuries of extreme, violent, protracted warfare among themselves, combined with the technology and advance of the Industrial Revolution, produce an unmatched military might. When rather late in the period of European colonial expansion, Europeans turned to Africa to satisfy their greed for resources, prestige, and empire. They quickly worked their way into Africa's society to gain allies and proxies, and to co-opt the conquered kings and chiefs, all to further their exploit. Consequently, the African response to this process, particularly the ways in which they resisted it, were complex. So it's important that we look at the complexity of the African nations that did not have the high military weapon technology of Europe, nor did the Africans have what we call the history of war culture. And that's not a light thing. The culture of war. European was a war society. It was a society that has had the 100-Year War, the War of Roses. They've been fighting wars ever since Europe came into existence. So there's a culture of war. Now armed with high-tech military weapons, 400 years of experience in the Americas and Asia of using these weapons and this war technology that would meet Africa in 1885. Now, adding to the complexity was the fact that rapid European imperial expansion in Africa did not necessarily change relationship among African communities. Those in conflict with one another tend to remain in conflict, despite the impeding threat from the French, the British, Germans, and other powers. There was, however, no broadly accepted African identity to unite around during this period. The strongest identities were, was the community itself, and as a lesser extent, religion, which begins to explain the presence of African participation in European conquest of other African societies. During the second half of the 19th century, for example, in what is now Ghana, the conflict between the Fanti and the Asante, which predated Britain, was designed on the Kingdom of Asante, was what motivated the Fanti to join the British against the Asante. They didn't see the consequences. Since they had a fight with the Asantes, the British had been on the coast trading and carrying on the slave trade for nearly 400 years. And so when the British offered an alliance, they worked out an alliance with the British. And so the Asante was a part of the British effort against the Ashantis. The Fanti, was a part of that British effort against the Asantes. So at the time, it seemed to be their greatest threat. They didn't think the Brits would be a threat. They thought they would go back to their little castles and go back home. But we found out that Europe don't work like that. The complexity of African political relationship among themselves then influenced the nature of their resistance to colonial rule. As they resist European invasion, they were confronted, both Europeans and African adversaries and soldiers. So that is, they confronted a political hierarchy imposed by the Western European that included African proxies. The power was European, but the face of it on the local level was often African. Despite the seeming contradiction, it remains insufficient to speak of African response to the imposition of colonialism in one instance, and in the next to resist European authoritarianism. It was also possible to limit European political control through some forms of collaboration with European generals or colonial administrators. what we begin to see leads to the response we see when we get to Menelik II, Emperor of Ethiopia, when he began fighting the Italians who had come in through what is now Eritrea. The Eritreans didn't see the Italians as an enemy. They thought that the greater Ethiopia was their enemy, and they could work out an alliance with the Italians to fight the greater Ethiopia. But that didn't work. Thank God, Menelik was able to unify the rest of the Ethiopian nation and then led his army to accomplish this unique feat in March 1896. This is less than 10 years after the invasion began, in defeating General Oreste Battisti's, the Italian army in Eritrea, who was allies with the Eritrean at the Battle of Adwa. Like Menelik, Samori Touré, who created a large Manding Empire in West Africa between the 1860s and the 1890s, was an inspiring political and military leader. But in the French, he faced a far more capable, tenacious, and experienced adversary than Menelik had in Italy. Samori's legacy remains controversial, yet he's significant, and that's because of the Islamic conquest and the jihads into indigenous communities. But he managed to hold the French at bay for so many years before he was captured and sent into exile. But we had others in the same area that was fighting. So though he did a good job in defeating the French was able to overcome them with their military technology. And don't underestimate the military technology. That's what defeated Africa, not the fantastic European armies and how much military technology they knew. They had a technology called the gun, and particularly what they call the Maxim back then, or the Gatling gun, or what we call the machine gun today. When they invented that weapon, we didn't have a chance. But we kept the battle going forward. And so we would see that as he conquered African territory, this is Samori, in engaging the conflict in Africa with his African competitors, the French pushed deeper into West Africa, into the interior, into Senegal, under the direction of Louis Field Herbie, or whatever this Frenchman's name, and his Senegalese troops, a corps of African soldiers. And the British pushed northwards, trying to trap Samori through Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast with a large contingent of Hausa soldiers. Each time the French attacked the territory, they would get routed. They just could not defeat this African army of Samori. But it was the gun technology that did it. And we have to take that gun technology into account for that day. It would not work today, but it worked then. What happened to us in most of these cases, we had to make these alliances to survive. We didn't think of Europeans as being another race or species. We just saw them as human beings. We didn't see them as we're Africans, they're Europeans. We saw them as human beings, we are as human beings. We have an enemy that we've been fighting with, and they are going to ally with us because they see that as their enemy also, and we thought we would so be left without freedom. We didn't know a Berlin conference had taken place. We didn't know there was a plan to invade every corner of Africa. We didn't know that this conspiracy involved the entire European world at the time. And so we watched the attacks come with the British and the French and the West. We watched the Germans come into Namibia and Tanzania. We watched the French in Senegal, Mali, what is now Mali, Senegal, Niger, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire. We watched the Dutch come into South Africa and then the British come into South Africa. We watched the Portuguese coming into East Africa and Mozambique, and in West Africa to Angola, or Southwest Africa to Angola. These were all military invasions, and rightfully in history, this should be called the First World War, because every European nation, after sitting down and plotting in Berlin, launched a military attack on Africa. And remember, Europeans was in Africa for nearly 400 years, but only on the coast. And they had made certain alliances and arrangements for trade and other things with our people. And so they were not new to us. We actually probably thought they were our friends. But now they had used the slave trade and they'd used the wealth of the Americas to trigger and initiate the Industrial Revolution. And they needed the natural resources that only Africa could provide to fuel that Industrial Revolution. And there's a man in history called Morton Stanley, who we hear about in our books they give us in school, that the man that went to Africa to find Dr. Livingstone and to save his life. And when he found Livingstone, he said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And we've all been taught in school to say, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. But no one told you that Stanley begun the process of genocide that would lead to the Berlin Conference, that would lead to Leopold taking over the Congo, because Leopold hired him and he killed hundreds of Africans in his march from the east coast of the Congo to the Atlantic Ocean. But what he and many others did was to find out what was there, what was the natural resources. And one of the big things in Europe at that time was copper. They needed copper. And they found that Africa had this abundance of copper. And they were all fighting for the copper. They were already looking for the gold. And then they learned about the manganese. And then they learned about the other natural resources in the ground that they could use to build their new Europe, to fuel and feed the Industrial Revolution. But the key thing to note, throughout this entire period of time, Africans resisted. Not one day since 1885 did we not resist the Europeans coming into our land. So let me just read a little piece about the cultural and religious resistance. Not all resistance during the early years of European colonial rule took the form of pragmatic violence. Most was more subtle and direct towards local issues of political, economic, and economic autonomy. Politically, or particularly in the British territories, Africans commonly used local movements to resist European colonial policies or practices by the colonial administration and its African proxies. In 1929, the Aba Women's Revolt, I think this is among the Igbo people, and this is what triggers the woman revolt in Igbo land, and then in Cameroon, and then in Nigeria. This, by the time of the First World War, these resistance by the African woman would end up triggering what became that move between World War I and World War II for liberation. One of the ways we resisted, because the Europeans had gotten into the First World War, but they didn't have enough soldiers. And most people don't know, a couple of million of us fought in that war, and hundreds of thousands of us died in that war from the continent of Africa. But for every one that they were able to get to go to that war, there was one African who resisted joining their military. And many even had to go in exile from their own countries in order to do this. The other thing the Europeans needed in order to sustain themselves in World War I, they needed the natural resources of Africa, and they needed the food products of Africa to feed their troops. But nobody talks about this in the history books. or to fuel their plants that was building their military technology. Well, almost 50% of Africans resisted both that by refusing to work or sabotaging the job, and many even led armed resistance. There wasn't a single decade that went by that we didn't have multiple armed resistance against European occupation. Not a single decade. So when we try to think of the revolutionary movement now, what we call the liberation movement, from day one, there's been a liberation movement. If we look at, we've talked about Menelik, but look at the Sudan with Muhammad Ahmed, whereas the Turks and the British coming out of Egypt tried to conquer Sudan, and they meet Muhammad Ahmed, called the Mahdi. And he was able to kill the British General Gordon and defeat the army of 23,000 Turks and Brits that came down to conquer Sudan. And after his death, by poisoning, which was probably some sort of collaborator sabotage, Abdullah came to power and began to lead the Sudan. But he was defeated by the French being able to come to his back from the west and the Brits from the north, and they were able to finally take the Sudan and get control of the Nile, because controlling the Nile River was key to conquering the interior of the continent. But in the country of what we now call Zimbabwe, we had a great lady. We had this